are talking about the new fantasy series, The Witcher. This one stars Henry Cavill, Freya Allan, and Anya Shalota. Now, this one based off a series of books that were kind of published in Poland initially, but probably most people know this from the video games that kind of preceded it, obviously some years later. Now, I've actually had an interesting history with this kind of property, because I actually bought the video game, I think it was the second video game when it first came out years ago, but never actually ended up playing it, because I was a big fan of the Elder Scrolls game. I thought this looks kind of similar. But I just never got round to playing it, so it just sat on my shelf the whole time. And there's actually a previous series of this, which was a Polish-produced series of The Witcher, and the same thing. I had that and never actually got round to watching it. I did want to try and review it before I did this one, but I just don't have the time. It's just a thing. So I'm very much aware of the property, but never have really kind of delved into it, if that makes sense. Now, I feel this is a property that probably a lot of people are familiar with due to the games, less so than the books. So I'm going to come in this from a person who is aware of the property but never actually kind of delved into it, with either the games or the books. So the story is of the Witcher, who is played by Henry Cavill, Geralt, I think his name is, or Geralt. And he's essentially a kind of, they call him a mutant, but it sounds like he's been kind of almost created by magic rather than kind of science, or sciencey magic, to become a kind of hybrid monster hunter. So he has limited kind of magical abilities and kind of durability and stuff like that. And he kind of goes around and hunts monsters. But essentially 8 of these episodes are him kind of going to different places the majority of the time, trying to find different monsters, but finding out there, in pretty much in each case, there may be more to it than kind of meets the eye. That's the overall kind of like episodic view. And in the kind of the background of this, you have this this kind of army of religious fanatics kind of sweeping the kind of the continent, and this is the kind of the overall arc where we have this kind of, I think, the Nilf something, or the Nilf Guard or something, sweeping the kind of the country and taking over various kind of factions. I think this is because of the more of the overall arc there. And then we have these kind of 2 female characters, one of which is this kind of princess who's running away from the kingdom which has been taken over by the Nilfgaard, and she may have a connection to the Witcher. And we have this other kind of sorceress who was kind of picked up from obscurity and now is becoming this kind of like this powerful mage, and she, you know, obviously introduced to the mix as well. So that's your kind of plot breakdown, very kind of loosely. I'm going to say something here which is very mildly spoilery, but I feel knowing this is going to make your enjoyment of this series a lot better, because there's a huge issue with this series. When you are watching this series, not everything you are watching is happening at the same time, but the series does not tell you this, and it doesn't really ever tell you explicitly ever, but you piece together as the kind of the series kind of progresses, but it doesn't really start giving you clues until kind of episode 4, really, and even then it's not sort of spelled out for you. So the issue with this series, it is so convoluted. Now, before I watched this series, I watched one review on YouTube who praised it, and I saw a couple of kind of like comments of people who were saying how great it was and things like this. So I was expecting, the new Game of Thrones, and it isn't. It's not the new Game of Thrones. There's none of the kind of the sophistication of that series. And I'm going to say it looks cheaper than Game of Thrones. Now, I know Netflix has spent a lot of money on this, but it doesn't look as lavish as Game of Thrones. It does. They've obviously spent some money on it. I would liken this series to more along the lines of Legend of the Seeker. So you may not be aware of that series. So this was also a fantasy series that was based on a series of books that was for American network television, and it's more of a kind of networky kind of feel to it, and more of a cheesy kind of like throwaway kind of piece of entertainment. It does have a kind of overall arc, but it was more episodic in nature than, say, the Game of Thrones. Now, The Witcher is much more like that, albeit it's got a little bit more kind of gore, swearing, and nudity in it, but it's kind of has it's much more the same story structure as something like Legend of the Seeker, compared to Game of Thrones, which I just, it's a fantasy series. And outside of that, I feel it says little outside of violence, boobs, and swearing, really. So it's kind of like, that's where we are. Now, this series does look very kind of like atmospheric. It's far more fantasy heavy than Game of Thrones. There's lots of kind of like magic on display, creatures, things like this. So this is much more along the lines of a kind of a Dungeons and Dragons sort of style landscape, rather than the slightly more muted fantasy that we're maybe used to in Game of Thrones now. And I'm going to say, although I do like some elements here, I didn't think this series was particularly great, if you want my honest opinion. I think our central character here, Geralt of Rivia, oh God, I can't remember the names, but he's like the epitome of what a adolescent male fantasy is. You want to be this strong, good-looking, stoic kind of like lone wolf warrior that blows into town, kills the monsters, and lays the girls. That is like such a kind of a typical kind of like adolescent kind of male fantasy. This put on screen, I'm just surprised as many people like this as they do, honestly. And the other thing, like I've mentioned, the narrative structure of this series is all over the place. Now you have seen both series and films have stories that are kind of told in a non-linear fashion. But I feel that you have to be a very skilled storyteller to make that work. Now, obviously, with this series, you're having different directors and things like this, each kind of episode, and this series does not have that strong narrative. It's just confusing. You don't know what you are watching. Now, I've seen a lot of people who have read the books and watched the games really enjoy this movie, and I think if you are more familiar with this story, then you'll get this much more out of it. But if you are not familiar with the story, like myself, it just seems like, what am I watching? I just don't understand what is going on. And it will start kind of making more sense as the series progresses. Really, from episode 4, you kind of start thinking, oh, I kind of start getting it now. But then you're not really sure whether you're watching things in kind of like in the future or the past or the present, even after that point. The story, I mean, this is, if you've seen the series Westworld, that had a similar trick, but it did it to a lesser degree, the first series of Westworld. And it wasn't people didn't really like it then, and this is the same thing, but done so much poorly. And I just don't think the narrative structure is strong here. Unless you are familiar with the series, the actual source material, then you'll kind of understand what players are meant to be. But if you're unfamiliar, I find it's a very, very convoluted series. Now, there are some great visuals here. I do think kind of like Henry Cavill does make quite the kind of like the stoic badass hero, but even his character I didn't really understand. Like he's followed by this bard some of the times when we're seeing him in some time periods, but not in others. But we won't tell you when that is. And he's like, "You're annoying me, go away." But he kind of still puts up with him and kind of like he almost goes out of his way to help him a few times, but we never see any type of kind of bondship with there. The other thing, I mean, this is I don't know how much this is actually the source material and how much is the adaptation, but one of the issues is, and I think this is from the source material really, is that because he's this Witcher and he's this this kind of like mutant, he doesn't feel human emotions. But it makes him a really uninteresting character to watch, unfortunately, because of that. Because he's like very kind of like stoic, doesn't really kind of ever show any emotion, does not make a particularly interesting central character, unfortunately. Although sometimes you're thinking, that's an emotion. Why, surely you're feeling some emotions there. Much more interesting are our two kind of female central protagonists who actually have, I would say, a little bit more of an emotional arc and a little bit more of a kind of a story arc. I'm not going to go too much in because that involves some more spoilers. But our two kind of female leads, I do think actually are a bit more interesting. And the series does spend a good amount of time in it. This is not just kind of Henry Cavill's series, and in actual fact, in some episodes, he's more or less sidelined for most of the episode in one or two episodes here. There are a couple of what I think are stronger episodes. There's an episode where they go on a dragon hunt, which it's a bit more self-contained, which I felt was one of the better episodes for me as a kind of a standalone one. And I think episode 4 is maybe the episode where you need to pay attention the most, because there's a throwaway line in there which is pretty much the linchpin of this series in regards to the kind of the plot. Overall, I found this series pretty disappointing. I had to struggle. My review is a little later after it's come out, because I was going to originally binge it, but I just couldn't do it. It just was not as interesting as I wanted it to be. But I finished it because I wanted to get the review out. But I found this a bit of a slog. I really hope that they change direction a little bit in later seasons. I think if you're a fan of the source material, you'll get a lot more out of it, because you'll just be familiar with where things are supposed to happen, and therefore seeing it in live action is you don't have to kind of piece together what the hell is meant to be going on here. I feel there's some fundamental issues with just having a character who is this male fantasy with no emotion, that is just kind of like ultimately kind of quite boring, if I'm honest. And I've got to say, the CGI is a bit wonky sometimes, although it's kind of, in some aspects it looks good, and the set design looks good, and the fight scenes are very good, I'll say that. The choreography is very good, but it does look cheaper in other aspects as well. There's some of the CGI bandits are a little bit kind of like, ooh, that's a mid-90s CGI. Anyway, this series, season 1, I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10. I really wasn't that impressed. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.